I have something absolutely radical to talk to you about today, and that is how to solve a social problem. There's a lot of social problems, we'd all agree right now, in the United States. And in fact, I'd say there's a lot of social problems in my community, which is Wichita, Kansas. My radical idea and my request to you today is to begin thinking locally and logically about social problems. And to that end, I'm going to walk you through a very basic framework to solve a social problem, with, again, the encouragement being that you need to think local and you need to think small to solve social problems. It's often the case in society that we get so wrapped around the axle about changing the world and making the world a better place, we tend to forget that our village is where we live and our community is where it matters. And that's why today, again, I'm going to talk about social problem solving on a local and logical level. And I'm going to ask you to think about climbing a mountain and how it starts with one step. Very simple steps. You see, the framework for solving a social problem is absolutely very simple in the end. The framework is first and foremost to identify a local social problem. Identifying something that matters to you in your community, and then asking yourself, what does your community do vis-a-vis or associated with the social problem? The next step to solve a social problem is to get really specific or to get narrowly defined. We tend to think in broad landscapes, and we tend to think in terms of one size fits all. It doesn't. Let me be the first person to tell you, if you've never heard this in your life before, let me be the first person to tell you that one size does not fit all. And we tend to spend a lot of time in life trying to make one size fit every problem, or one solution fit every problem, because we're looking for a global answer to a local problem. Variety is how we find our local response. Research methods in the field of social problems tend to go in one of two directions: data intense or quantitative, or ethnography, and that is qualitative intense. The best methodology is one that's mixed, that has a variety. And to solve a social problem locally, we need a lot of variety. Last but not least, last thing I'm going to talk about really today as we go through a social problem, and I show the work, if you will, show you how to solve a social problem, is to think in terms of analyzing and sharing. Analyzing and sharing. Research that happens in a vacuum matters to no one. Candidly, my village is Wichita, Kansas. Born and bred. I'm a Kansas girl through and through. And something that's always bothered me in my community while I worked as a prosecutor and as I'm working as an instructor in higher education here in Wichita, Kansas, is the rate of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in my community. In fact, growing up in this community, I saw a lack of response in instances and poor responses in instances. In that regard, I picked as my social problem that I wanted to solve in my community domestic violence. And you see up there, public safety absolutely has to include a conversation about battered women and children. And necessarily, this is from Ellen Pence and Dorothy Smith, the Safety and Accountability Audit that they conducted a long time ago. Necessarily, to think about women and children in your community, you need to think about institutions. This is where the social scientist in all of us gets into the game. When we're solving a social problem, we need to use our social science to do that. And in this regard, we need to examine institutional policies on a local level to see what is happening in our community when there is domestic violence or sexual violence. We actually had the opportunity to do this here in Wichita, Kansas, and I had the good fortune of helping a team, a multidisciplinary team, come together to look at the social problem of intimate partner or domestic and sexual violence here in Wichita. We came together and started this project in 2017, and we asked ourselves, what is the problem in our community? How do we know it's a problem, and what can we do about it? You see up there the list of all the partners or stakeholders that got involved in this process. We had nurses involved, teachers involved, prosecutors involved, officers involved, advocates, social workers involved. We all got together and we asked ourselves, what are the institutions associated with domestic and sexual violence in Wichita, Kansas? We based our project on some framework that exists, and it's framework that I think by extension could apply and be used to solve many social problems in your community. It's called the Safety and Accountability Audit, developed by Praxis International back in 1997. We used that framework because it's been used in other communities throughout the United States. But the framework, again, it's pretty simple. It's go into your community and ask, where's the problem? What happens when in my community? A process. In the end, what we're talking about today is a process. How do we solve a social problem using the resources we have locally? Wichita, this was the question I asked in my community and that we engaged in. How does Wichita, or Sedgwick County in the state of Kansas, how do we respond institutionally when someone discloses that they have been the victim of domestic or sexual violence? To answer the question, we had to map. We had to go in and follow what happens when somebody calls, for instance, 911 and says, I'm the victim of domestic or sexual violence. We had to narrowly define our areas of concentration. In this regard, what we were able to do locally, because again, we were so concentrated, we asked ourselves, what happens when someone calls 911? Truthfully, friends, have you ever been inside 911 operations? Probably not. Unless you've worked as a call taker or a dispatcher, you've never been inside and you've never watched how calls are taken. We went and did this. Just watch. We read transcripts, we listened to recordings, and we were able to map and determine where a caller goes after they call 911. We were able to distinguish paths and put it into a map that we can share with community members to show this is where phone calls go. If someone calls and says, this bad thing happened to me, this is what happens to the caller. We also were able to go to crime analysts that are already collecting data in our community and ask them, where are all the calls? Where is domestic violence and sexual violence happening in our community, in our local village? And we found that in the city of Wichita, as you see up there, it's hard to note from a distance, but I promise you, there are but 4 or 5 quadrants or locations where there's a heavy concentration of all the domestic and sexual violence in Wichita, Kansas. Something we thought to be true was now supported through the process of solving a social problem. That then led us to ask ultimately, what's the maximum or the most volume that we have in Sedgwick County in regards to domestic and sexual violence? And you see, we have over 70,000 calls about domestic violence in any given year in my city, in Wichita, Kansas. To find out what happens when somebody calls 911 and says, this happened to me, domestic or sexual violence, we chose between 4 things. And we, in fact, in this process, were able to do all of them because we had a whole year to do it. But you don't have to do all of these to solve a social problem. In fact, I'd suggest to you, just doing one of these things can help illuminate the solution, help you solve the social problem locally. Focus groups are great. Go talk to people that have experienced this. Work practice interviews, interview and talk to people that do this all day. Text, looking at the rules, looking at the policies and the procedures, and then finally just field observations. We are people watchers, absolutely, and we can learn a lot by watching people, and we can learn a lot about what goes wrong when we watch people. For this purpose, I want to show you what we found out when we went into the community and we asked people, what happens when you call 911? Shockingly, we found out that people in our community, particularly survivors of domestic violence, don't call 911. And we asked them, why don't you call 911? The goal, of course, being, how do we get people to call 911? Right, we can deal with them once they get to 911, but if they don't even call, how can we ever give them help? People told us, survivors during our focus groups, I was raised not to call 911. Right? It adds gas to the fire. It's another reason to get beat up. We heard those themes over and over again, and we asked ourselves, what can we do about it? Then we went and we talked to the people that work at 911, and we found out through a work practice interview that the individuals who take the call have to make a determination, right? Is this a domestic violence event or not? If the parties don't self-identify as being involved in an intimate partner relationship, then the event is not categorized or qualified as a domestic violence incident, which led us to 2 grand conclusions from those sources of information. One, There's probably a lot more domestic violence in my city than I realize because it doesn't get reported. And even when I look at the numbers of reports that we have, what does get reported, it's not accurate. It's not accurate because we don't always get it right. We got some numbers, just some raw numbers from law enforcement. When you are solving a social problem, you have to go to different sources. Absolutely. Think in terms of institutions and think in terms of local institutions. In this regard, we ask local law enforcement, how many calls do you get annually about domestic violence and sexual violence? They were able to give us their numbers. Then we went back to 911 and we said, you tell us your numbers. And then we went back to survivors and we said, you tell us how many times you call. And the crazy thing is, when you start talking to people to try and solve a social problem, you find out where the problems are. And the biggest problem we found in this specific area, this narrowly defined concentration area of the social problem, is that Sedgwick County Emergency Communications is woefully understaffed. They don't have enough people to take the calls. Even if I can get you to call 911, there may not be somebody there to help you. That's terrifying in my community. We can complain about it, and look at what I can show you. On average, there's over 1,000, over 500,000, 650,000 calls to 911. And there are only, look at that, 66 dispatchers and 16 call takers. That's very few people to do a lot of work. Not enough people. So what's the solution? As a social scientist, right? As a social scientist, we have to look at the research and say, what is the takeaway? Okay? Where are people going? Why are we not getting people first and foremost to call 911? And then what's happening to them after they call 911? And the solution is to propose a way to fix it. In this case, we proposed as a team, as a multidisciplinary team, using our experts in the field. We said, you know what you need to do? You need to pay people better. You need to increase the wage. We need to acknowledge that this is a terribly important job in our community. Being the one who answers the phone when somebody has experienced domestic or sexual violence is a huge deal. Second, we said, give them more employees. We need more. We need more people answering the phone so that no calls get lost and everybody has training. See, the thing with a social problem is you can complain about it all day, but until you start looking for solutions, you're not going to change anything. And that's when we put a bow on it, if you will. We need to scream about the solutions. We need to scream about what we learned in the process of conducting research. And that's what we were able to do here locally when we did examine sexual and domestic violence response in Wichita, Kansas. We were able to scream about it. We were able to publicize it. And we were able to reflect that, you know, Margaret Mead told us a long time ago that a small group of people who are committed can change the world. And she went so far in her quote to say that, in fact, it's the only thing, that small group of people, they're the only thing that can ever change the world. We got a twist on it here. And this is the radical idea that I want you to take away from today. That is that a powerful group of local people can change their community. And in fact, the local folks are the only folks that can change a community. In fact, they're the only ones that can solve a social problem in the United States. Thank you.